Wyoming Territory, January 1874. The mountains do not care who lives or dies beneath them. Snow. Inside the Elkhorn Saloon, 40 men are drinking and laughing. Every candle on every table flickers. The laughter dies, of not slowly, but all at once. And those hands, they are shaking. The biggest, most feared man in the territory is
The winter of 1874 came to Wyoming Territory like a judgment, not a slow cold that crept in from the north and gave a man time to prepare, but a sudden, total thing. A hammer dropped from a clear sky that cracked the earth and swallowed the roads whole and left the mountains looking like the bones of something ancient that had died standing up. Coldwater Ridge sat in the valley between those bones. 24 buildings, maybe 140 people if you counted the ones who lived close enough to call themselves part of the town. They burned wood and prayed and ate what they had put away in autumn, and they did not waste words or warmth because survival out here had never been a poetic thing. It was ugly and repetitive and mean, and everybody knew it, and nobody complained much because complaining cost heat. The people of Coldwater Ridge had a saying about the high country above the valley. They said that if you went far enough into those mountains, past the second ridge and over the frozen creek and through the stands of pine so thick the snow barely reached the ground, you would eventually find Eli Vance. And if you found Eli Vance, you had gone too far. He was not a man people sought out. He was a man people told stories about, and there is a difference. The stories had accumulated over 19 years of near-total solitude, each one adding a layer to a legend that had long since stopped resembling anything human. They said he had walked 30 miles through a blizzard with a broken leg rather than accept help. They said he had fought off a pack of wolves with nothing but a skinning knife and his bare hands and had come away with less blood than the wolves. They said he had once gone 8 months without speaking a single word to another living soul and had seemed the better for it. Nobody knew if these stories were true. Nobody had been close enough to Eli Vance long enough to verify. What they knew for certain was that he stood 6 feet and 4 inches in his worn boots, that his shoulders were wide enough to carry a full-grown elk without slowing his pace, that his beard grew wild and dark with threads of early gray running through it like frost on old timber, and that his hands, when you saw them, looked like they had been carved from the same granite as the mountains he called home. He came into Coldwater Ridge twice a year to trade pelts. He arrived, conducted his business with the minimum necessary conversation, and left. He did not eat at the boarding house. He did not drink at the Elkhorn Saloon. He did not linger. The man moved through the town like weather, noticed, respected, and never truly known. 8 months had passed since his last visit. So when the door of the Elkhorn Saloon banged open on the night of January the 14th and cold air rushed in like something alive and angry, snuffing out half the candles on the tables and sending a shiver through every man in the room, and Eli Vance stepped out of the dark into the lamplight with snow crusted in his beard and ice across the shoulders of his bearskin coat and his gray eyes sweeping the room with that quality of absolute stillness that made lesser men look away, nobody laughed. Not at first. He was breathing harder than a man that size should breathe. His chest rose and fell in a way that suggested he had covered the 15 miles from his cabin in the mountains at something faster than a walk. His face was wind-burned raw, the skin tight across the planes of his cheekbones, and when he pulled off his gloves and dropped them on the bar, his hands were shaking. Ox Pruitt had owned the Elkhorn Saloon for 11 years. He had killed a man in Denver before that, though he did not advertise it. He was not a man who startled easily. But when he saw Eli Vance's hand shaking, he took an involuntary step backward and his own hand dropped below the bar before he caught himself and made it stop. Eli looked at the room. He looked at the men along the bar and the men at the tables and the small cluster of women sitting near the wood stove in the back. A laundress, a cook from the boarding house named Gertrude, and a woman in a plain gray dress with dark hair pulled severely back who Ox knew as Hester Voss, who rented a room upstairs and did sewing work and kept entirely to herself. Then Eli turned back to the bar. His voice came out rough like something that had rusted from disuse. It probably had. He said one word, whiskey. Ox poured without asking questions. The glass looked like a toy in Eli's grip. He drank it in a single swallow, set it down with a sound like a gavel, and then turned to face the room. He said, "I need a wife." The words dropped into the silence like stones into a frozen pond. For 3 full seconds, nobody reacted. The fire in the wood stove crackled. The wind pressed against the windows. And then a man in the back, a logger named Denton, who had been drinking since mid-afternoon, started to laugh. A nervous sound, disbelieving, the kind of laugh that happens when the body does not know what else to do with what it has just heard. And the laugh spread, the way laughter always spreads in a room full of men who are cold and frightened and looking for release, and within moments the Elkhorn Saloon was shaking with it. Men slapped tables. Someone whistled. Denton doubled over wheezing, unable to get words out, gesturing vaguely at Eli as though his presence alone was the punchline. Eli did not move. He stood with his back against the bar and his massive arms at his sides, and he looked at the room, and he did not laugh, and he did not look angry, and the stillness of him was so complete and so unlike anything the laughing men had seen before that it began to work on them slowly. The laughter started to falter. One man stopped, then another. Then Denton looked up from his wheezing and saw Eli's face, and whatever he saw there ended the sound in his throat as though someone had closed a hand around it. The room went quiet, and in that quiet they saw what Ox had already seen. They saw that Eli Vance's hands were shaking. They saw that his eyes, gray as a January sky, were wet, not with tears that were falling, with tears that were being held back by a kind of will that seemed to cost the man something physical, like holding a door shut against a storm. He said again, more quietly this time, "I need a wife before sunrise." And then he said what he had ridden 15 miles through a Wyoming winter to say. 3 weeks ago, he told them, he had found a wagon in the canyon east of his cabin, broken axle. The couple inside, a man and a woman, both dead of fever, 2 days dead, maybe 3. He had smelled it before he saw it. He had gone to investigate because that was what a man did when he found something wrong in his territory, and he had opened the wagon cover expecting to find nothing alive. The boy was 8 years old. He had his father's coat wrapped around his sister, and he was holding her against him, and when the light hit them both, he did not make a sound. He just looked at Eli with eyes that had already seen the worst thing they were ever going to see, and he waited to find out what came next. The girl was 5, blonde hair. She had been crying so long she had nothing left, and she was just sitting there dry-eyed in a way that was worse than crying. Eli brought them back to his cabin, fed them, kept them warm. The boy's name was Cormac. The girl's name was Wren. He had meant to bring them into town when the pass cleared, find someone to take them in, find them a proper home with proper people who knew how to give a child what a child needed. That had been the plan. Then the territorial marshal had ridden through. The law in Wyoming Territory was particular about orphan children. A man without a wife keeping 2 children in his home was in violation of territorial statutes regarding the guardianship of minors. The marshal, a man named Cade with a badge in a manner that suggested the badge was not his real employer, had delivered the message plainly. Get a wife, get a proper household, or the children go to the orphanage in Cheyenne on my next pass-through, which is at dawn. Someone in the back of the room swore softly. Everyone in Wyoming Territory knew about the Cheyenne orphanage. It was not a place where children went to find new families. It was a place where children went to disappear, where they were contracted out to factories and mines and anyone else who needed small bodies for hard work, where they were shipped east to situations that no one in Coldwater Ridge had ever tracked far enough to know the ending of. It was a place where a boy named Cormac, who had held his sister through 3 nights of terror, would be separated from her the moment they arrived, and where a girl named Wren would stop being a little girl and start being a number in a ledger. The marshal is coming back at sunrise, Eli said. His voice was steady but barely. He has a wagon. The room absorbed this. Ox rubbed his face with both hands. He did not say what everyone was thinking, which was that this was insane, that you could not marry someone in the middle of the night in a saloon on 15 minutes of acquaintance, that there was not a woman in this room or in this town who would agree to such a thing. He did not say it because Eli Vance's hands were still shaking, and something about that fact made certain words feel like the wrong tool for the moment. He said instead, quietly, Eli, you cannot just find a wife like you find a lost trap. Eli reached into his coat and laid a folded piece of paper on the bar. He had ridden to the county clerk in Bridger the week before. He had a marriage license. It was legal. All it needed was a signature, a minister, and a woman willing to put her name on it before 7 o'clock in the morning. He looked around the room. He met eyes where eyes were willing to be met. Most of the men looked away. The women near the stove sat very still. I am not a good man to live with, Eli said. I know that. I have nothing to offer except a roof that holds and enough firewood to last the winter and more work than any person should have to do. But I will keep her safe. I will work every day of my life to make sure she does not regret it. And those children need someone who knows how to be gentle with them. He stopped. His jaw worked for a moment. I do not know how to be gentle. I know how to trap and hunt and survive, but I do not know how to make a little girl stop crying in the night because she wants her mother. He looked at the floor, then back up. And so I am asking. I am not too proud to beg. If there is a woman in this town who will take a chance on a rough man and 2 frightened children, I will spend whatever years I have left making sure she does not regret it. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room completely, top to bottom, corner to corner, the way cold air fills a space when you open a door in January. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The women near the stove looked at each other and then looked at the floor. It was too much. It was midnight, and this was a lifetime, and the frontier did not give you easy exits from decisions made in the small hours with the wind pressing against the windows and a desperate man standing in front of you. Eli stood there for a long moment. He looked at the room one more time, and whatever he saw there, or did not see, settled something in his face into a kind of grim acceptance. He nodded once, the way a man nods when he has confirmed what he already feared. He reached for his gloves, and then a voice came from the back of the room. It was quiet. It did not waver. It was female. It said, "Wait." Eli stopped. Hester Voss stood up from her chair near the stove. She was 34 years old. She was thin in a way that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with years of not quite enough food and not quite enough reason to be careful about eating. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun that had been practical once and had become habitual long after the practicality was gone. She wore a plain gray dress that had been mended so many times the original fabric was more suggestion than substance. Her hands were rough from needlework. Her face had been pretty once, before the years had carved their particular lines around her mouth and her eyes. She looked directly at Eli Vance the way a person looks at something they are trying to measure accurately. "You said their names are Cormac and Wren," she said. Eli turned slowly. "Yes, ma'am. How long have they been with you?" 3 weeks. "Are they sick?" "No, ma'am. Healthy. Eating well." She moved then, crossing the room between the tables, and the whole saloon watched her go with the attention of people witnessing something they do not yet understand. She was small. When she stopped a few feet from Eli, she barely reached the middle of his chest. But there was something in the way she held herself, something in the set of her spine and the steadiness of her eyes that made her seem taller than she was. "I need to know one thing," she said. "And I need the truth of it, not what you think I want to hear." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him, really looked, the way you look at a horse you are considering trusting your life to. "Will you be kind to them?" she said. The question did something to Eli Vance's face. It moved through him visibly, like a change in weather moving across open ground, and what came after it was not the quick certainty of a man saying what a woman wants to hear. It was something slower, something that looked like it cost him. He opened his mouth, closed it. Then he said, "I will be kind. I swear it to you, ma'am. I will be kind to them and to you. I do not know how to be a husband, and I do not know how to be a father, but I know how to keep my word, and I am giving it to you right now. I will be kind." She studied him for a long moment. The room waited. Then she said, "I have 3 conditions." Eli looked as though something in him had just given way. He said, "Anything." "I am not your property," Hester said. "I will be your wife in name and I will help raise those children, but I am not signing my life away to be anyone's servant. We are partners or we are nothing. Yes, ma'am, you do not touch me unless I say it is all right. I do not care what the law says about a husband's rights. My body is mine." Eli's face went red, but he nodded immediately. "Yes, ma'am, I understand completely. If those children are hurt or frightened or treated poorly, I am gone. Middle of winter or not, I will walk back to this town and you will not see me again. The children come first, always." "They do," Eli said immediately. "They will. I promise you that." Hester took a breath, let it out slowly, then she held out her hand. "Then we have an agreement." Eli stared at her hand for a moment, like a man looking at something he does not quite believe is real. Then carefully, he reached out and took it. His hand swallowed hers completely, but his grip was gentle. Something about the gentleness of it seemed to surprise even him. He said very quietly, "Thank you. I do not know how to." "Don't," Hester said. "Not yet. We will figure out what this is as we go." Ox had already disappeared through the back. He returned 20 minutes later with Reverend Whitmore, a small dried-out man of 70 who had performed more weddings and burials in Coldwater Ridge than he could accurately count, and who looked at the situation before him with the expression of a man who had stopped being surprised by people some years ago. He said, "You are both fools." He said it without malice. "But I have seen worse reasons to get married, and at least you are doing it for the children." He produced his register from the bag he carried everywhere. "Let us make this quick. I am old and the cold gets into my joints." The ceremony lasted less than 5 minutes. There were no flowers and no music, and the only witnesses were Ox and 2 men at the bar who were sober enough to sign their names. Eli repeated his vows in a voice so low that Hester had to lean slightly toward him to hear the words. When it came time for her vows, her voice was steady. Not brave, exactly. Something past brave. Something that had come out the other side of fear and found a kind of flat ground there. When it was done, Reverend Whitmore produced the marriage certificate, and they each signed it. Eli's handwriting was slow and careful, the letters formed with the deliberate attention of a man who had not written his name in some time. Hester's signature was small and precise. Whitmore pressed his seal into the wax, handed the document to Eli, and said, "Congratulations. Try not to freeze on the way home." He looked at Eli, then at Hester. "You can kiss the bride if that is something you intend to do." Hester shook her head once. Eli looked almost relieved. "Fine," said Whitmore. "Saves time." Hester went upstairs to her room and packed everything she owned into a single canvas bag. It did not take long. She owned very little: a change of dress, her sewing kit, a leather-bound book that had been her mother's, the only thing she had carried from her life before. She stood in the center of that small room for a moment and looked at the walls she had stared at for 3 years. She felt nothing. This room had never been home. Home had been something else, something that had existed before the cholera took her husband Thomas and their infant daughter Sarah in the same terrible week 6 years ago, and there was no going back to what home had been. This room was just a place where she had waited to die without quite managing to do it. She picked up her bag. She did not look back. When she came down the stairs, Eli was waiting near the door. He had cleaned his face as best he could and run a hand through his hair and straightened his coat, none of which had helped much. He still looked like a mountain that had learned to walk. He looked at her bag, then at her. "You travel light," he said. So do you by the look of it, she said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but something in that direction. They stepped out into the January night. The cold was immediate and absolute. Hester had thought she was prepared for it after 3 years in Wyoming territory, and she was wrong. This was a different cold from the kind that lived in town, where buildings and bodies pressed close and the collective warmth of human proximity took the edge off. This was mountain cold, clean and brutal, the kind that found every gap in your clothing and moved in like it owned the place. Eli helped her onto the horse, a large dark animal that stood motionless in the snow with the patience of something accustomed to waiting, and then swung up behind her and they moved out of Coldwater Ridge and into the dark. For the first mile she held herself rigid, aware of the strangeness of his nearness, the size of him, the fact that she was riding 15 miles into the mountains before dawn with a man she had known for approximately 40 minutes. Then the cold became more pressing than the strangeness, and she pressed closer to his back the way you press close to a fire when the alternative is freezing, and she focused on breathing and not thinking too far ahead. They did not speak for a long time. The trail climbed steadily. The trees thickened around them, pine and spruce pressing close on both sides, their branches heavy with snow, the darkness between them absolute. The horse's breathing made small clouds in the air. Somewhere distant, something called once and was silent. How far? Hester said. Another mile, Eli said. His voice was different out here, quieter, more at home than it had sounded in the saloon. You all right? I am cold. Yes, he paused. I am sorry about that. Did you arrange the weather? No. Then you have nothing to be sorry about. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you should have a warmer coat. I will get you one. This one is adequate. It is not. She did not argue. He was right. The cabin appeared suddenly when they came through a break in the trees, as though it had been there all along, just waiting to be found. Hester had expected something small and rough and half-buried. The cabin was larger than she had anticipated, built from thick logs with the care of someone who understood that shelter was not optional in this country. A stone chimney leaked smoke into the gray pre-dawn sky. A small barn stood nearby, a woodpile that could have lasted 2 winters. A creek running somewhere close, its voice muffled under ice. Eli brought the horse to a stop and dismounted and helped her down, his hands careful at her waist, and she let him because her legs had gone partly numb. Wait here, he said. Let me speak to them first. He walked to the cabin door and opened it, and Hester heard a child's voice almost immediately, high and frightened and trying not to be. Where were you? You said you would be back before I woke up. I know. I am sorry, Cormac. Something came up. What came up? What is wrong? Nothing is wrong. Eli's voice carried something in it that Hester had not heard before. Something careful and deliberate, like a large man moving through a room full of breakable things. Everything is fine. Better than fine. A pause. Then suspicious. Why are you smiling? Hester walked toward the door. When she stepped inside, 2 pairs of eyes locked onto her immediately and did not look away. The boy Cormac was small for 8, with dark hair going in several directions at once and eyes that had no business being that old and a face that young. He stood directly in front of his sister with the particular stance of someone who has learned that putting yourself between a threat and the thing you love is the only currency that matters. The girl Wren had blonde hair that had not been properly brushed in some weeks and blue eyes, so large they seemed to take up half her face. They both wore clothes that were too big, borrowed from their dead parents' belongings. They both looked terrified. This is Hester, Eli said. He said it carefully, the way a man says something he has been rehearsing. She is my wife. We were married tonight. Cormac's face went through several emotions in rapid succession. Confusion, disbelief, a flash of something that looked almost like betrayal. You got married, he said. I had to. Eli said, the marshal is coming this morning. He would have taken you and Wren away. You remember I told you about that, the law. So you just went and found a wife, Cormac said. His voice rose slightly. You cannot just find a wife. That is not how it works. Well, Eli said. I did. Cormac looked at Hester. The look was not friendly. It was the look of a child who has learned that the world takes things away and who has spent 3 weeks allowing himself to believe, carefully and with tremendous effort, that maybe this one thing might be safe. And now there was a stranger in the cabin. We do not need her, Cormac said. His voice was fierce. We do not. You and me and Wren, we are fine. We do not need someone coming in here to pretend she cares about us. The words landed somewhere in Hester's chest with more force than she had expected. She had told herself on the ride up that she was prepared for this. She had not been. She crouched down, brought herself to his eye level. He did not step back, which told her something about him. You are right, she said. Cormac blinked. I am a stranger, she said, and I am not your mother. I am not going to pretend to be. She kept her voice even. But I am here because Eli asked for help, and I said yes. Not because I think I can replace what you lost, not because I expect anything from you, but because sometimes people need help and sometimes other people are in a position to give it. Cormac's jaw tightened. His eyes were bright. Why would you help us? You do not even know us. Hester thought about the room upstairs at the Elkhorn. She thought about 6 years of waking up in the morning and not caring whether she did. She thought about her daughter Sarah, who had lived 6 months and taken with her every reason Hester had found to get out of bed. Because I know what it is to lose everything, she said. And I know what it is to be in that loss alone, with no one willing to come through the door. The silence in the cabin was different from the silence in the saloon. Smaller, more particular. Wren had been hiding behind Cormac throughout this exchange. Now she leaned around him and looked at Hester with eyes that were enormous and serious. "Are you nice?" she asked. Hester felt something move in her chest. "I try to be." Wren considered this with great solemnity. "Do you know how to make pancakes?" Despite everything, despite the exhaustion and the cold and the strangeness and the weight of what she had just done, something almost like a smile moved across Hester's face. "I do." Wren turned to Eli with the particular triumphant expression of a 5-year-old who has just proven a point. "Uncle Eli cannot make pancakes." She was very serious. "They taste like wood." "They do not taste like wood," Eli said. His voice had something in it that might have been dignity. "They taste like wood," Cormac said, quietly, not looking at anyone. It was the first thing he had said that was not a challenge. It was small, but it was something. Hester stood. "Then I will make breakfast," she said, "and after that we will figure out the rest of it. All of us. Together." She looked at Eli. "That is how this works," she said. "Together." Eli nodded. Something in his face had shifted. Something that had been held very tightly for a very long time had perhaps moved slightly. "Yes," he said. Together. The marshal arrived 2 hours later, just as the sun broke over the eastern ridge and threw long cold light across the clearing. He came on horseback with a wagon behind him, and his name was Cade, and he knocked on the cabin door with the businesslike manner of a man who expected it to open quickly. Eli opened it. Hester stood beside him. Her hand rested lightly on Wren's shoulder. Cormac stood on Eli's other side, his face set in a careful blankness that Hester recognized as something he had learned to wear over these past weeks. Cade looked at them. His eyes moved across the scene slowly, taking an inventory. "This your wife?" he said to Eli. "Yes, sir." "Got proof?" Eli produced the marriage certificate. Cade took it and studied it with the attention of a man looking for a reason to find fault. He found the seal. He found the signatures. He found the date and the time and the name of Reverend Whitmore, who had been performing legal ceremonies in this territory for 20 years. "Married last night," Cade said. "Yes, sir." Cade's eyes moved to Hester. "Awful convenient timing, Mrs. Vance." Hester met his gaze. "It is legal," she said, "and I am here of my own free will, and these children are being cared for in a proper household. That is what the law requires." She paused. "Is it not?" Cade looked at her for a long moment. He had the face of a man accustomed to other people looking away first. Hester did not look away. He folded the certificate and held it out to Eli. "I will be checking in," he said. "Anyone reports those children are being mistreated, I will be back with more than paperwork." "They will not be mistreated," Eli said. "Then we understand each other." Cade tipped his hat to Hester. The gesture was courtesy in form only. Then he turned, and before he mounted his horse, he looked directly at Eli and dropped his voice low. "Frank Dutton sends his regards," he said. "He mentioned that the land you run your lines on north of the second ridge will be needing new management come spring. Said to tell you that things have a way of changing when a man's circumstances change." He swung up onto his horse and rode out of the clearing without looking back. Eli stood in the doorway watching the wagon disappear into the trees. His face had gone very still. Not calm, the kind of still that comes right before something moves. "He is gone," Wren whispered from behind him. "He is gone," Eli confirmed. His voice was even. Hester had been standing close enough to hear every word Cade said. She did not tell Eli that. She filed it away instead, the name Dutton and the word land and the particular tone of a man delivering a message he had been paid to deliver, and she turned it over in her mind while Wren pressed against her side and Cormac stood at the window watching the empty trail. She understood something in that moment that the people in the Elkhorn saloon had not understood when they heard Eli Vance say he needed a wife. This was not about a legal technicality. This was not only about the welfare of 2 orphan children, though it was that too. This was about a man who owned something worth taking, and about powerful people who intended to take it, and about a law that could be used as a tool when you knew the right people to hold it. She had not agreed to marry a desperate mountain man. She had agreed to stand beside one in a fight she had not yet seen the full shape of. She was not afraid of that. She found, examining the thought carefully, that she was not afraid at all. She had spent 6 years with nothing left to lose. Having something to lose again was not the frightening thing it might once have been. It felt, in a way she could not quite name, like being alive. "Does that mean you are staying?" Wren asked from behind her. Hester turned and looked down at the small, serious face looking up at her. She thought about the empty room, the worn chair, the view from a window she had looked out of for 3 years without really seeing anything. "Yes," she said, "I am staying," and for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she meant it. The first week nearly broke all 4 of them in different ways. Hester woke before dawn every morning because the cold made sleeping past a certain point impossible, and because there was always fire to start and water to fetch, and a household that had been running on survival instincts alone for 3 weeks and needed something more than that now. She would lie in Eli's bed, which was her bed now, which he had given up without discussion, and moved himself to the floor by the stove, and she would stare at the ceiling in the dark and listen to the sounds of the cabin settling around her. The sounds were these. Eli's breathing, slow and deliberate, from across the main room, the breathing of a man who slept lightly and woke fast. The wind working at the gaps in the logs, finding the places where the chinking had dried and cracked and pushing through in thin, cold streams, the stove settling as the fire burned down. And from the small side room where Cormac and Wren slept on straw ticking covered with every blanket Eli owned, the sound that came almost every night without warning. Wren screaming, not crying. Screaming the way a child screams when sleep drops her back into something she cannot escape, when whatever the mind does in the dark to protect itself during the day stops working and the truth comes through raw and unfiltered. The first time it happened, Hester was on her feet before she was fully awake, moving through the dark cabin, and she burst into the children's room to find Wren sitting bolt upright with her eyes open and not seeing anything, and Cormac already beside her with his hand on her back saying her name over and over in a voice so patient and so tired that it told Hester everything about how long this had been going on. She stood in the doorway and did not rush in. She watched Cormac work, watched him do what he had been doing since the night their parents died, holding the line, keeping his sister on this side of whatever edge she stood at. After a moment, Wren's screaming subsided into sobbing, and then into the words that came every time. "I want Mama, I want Mama, I want Mama." Hester crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, not close enough to crowd, close enough to be present. "I know," Hester said quietly. "I know you do." Wren's crying broke its rhythm slightly. Something in those two words had been unexpected. Adults said other things. Adults said it was all right and everything would be fine and you need to be brave now. Adults said things that were not true and that a child who had been paying attention could identify as untrue. "I know you want your mama," Hester said, "and I am sorry she is not here. That is not fair. It is not right, and I cannot fix it." Wren looked at her. Her eyes were swollen and her face was wet and her blonde hair was pressed flat on one side and wild on the other. She looked very small. "But I am here," Hester said, "and I am not going anywhere, so if you need to cry, then you cry. I will sit right here until you are done." Wren cried for another 10 minutes. Hester sat without moving, her hand resting on the blanket near Wren's knee, close but not touching, offering presence without demand. Cormac sat on the other side of his sister and watched Hester with an expression she could not read in the dark. When Wren finally wound down to hiccups and silence, Hester stood. "Are you hungry?" she asked. Wren nodded, still hiccuping. "Then let us find something to eat." She walked back into the main room. Eli was sitting up on his blankets by the stove, his hair disordered, his face cracked with worry. He started to speak. "She is fine," Hester said quietly. "She is a little girl who lost her mother. She is going to cry. That is what little girls do." She moved toward the stove. "Go back to sleep." He did not go back to sleep. He sat and watched her work, and in the morning when she set cornmeal pancakes on the table, actual pancakes with a proper crust and a smell that filled the cabin with something resembling warmth, he looked at the plate and then at her and said, very simply, "Thank you." "Don't," Hester said. "It is breakfast." But Wren took one bite and her eyes went wide. She said with great solemnity that they did not taste like wood at all. Cormac ate 3 without saying anything, then a 4th. He did not thank her, but he ate, and Hester understood that this was its own kind of language. The cabin was in a state that required serious intervention. Hester had seen difficult living conditions in her years in Coldwater Ridge, and the cabin was not the worst she had encountered. But it was a single-man space in the most complete possible sense of the phrase. Dishes accumulated in a bucket that served as a wash basin and were addressed only when there were no clean ones remaining. Clothes lived on the floor in arrangements that suggested territory rather than organization. The corner where the children slept had not been properly cleaned since they arrived, and the smell made this plain. The windows had not been washed in so long that the light coming through them was filtered and gray even on bright days. The food stores were arranged by whatever order things had been thrown in rather than any system that would tell you at a glance what you had and what you were running low on. She looked at it all on that first full morning and felt a wave of exhaustion so complete it nearly knocked her sideways. Then she rolled up her sleeves. She assigned Cormac the firewood. Not asked, assigned. The distinction seemed to matter to him. He was given a task and a standard, and he went to it without further discussion, hauling wood from the pile outside and stacking it, with an 8-year-old's serious attention to doing the thing correctly. Wren was stationed at the wash bucket and tasked with handing Hester the dirty dishes one at a time while Hester scrubbed. Wren treated this responsibility with an intensity that suggested she had been waiting for someone to give her something real to do. Hester worked until her hands bled. She scrubbed dishes and swept floors and stripped the children's bedding and boiled it in a pot over a fire she built outside in the snow, steam rising in white columns in the cold air. She reorganized the food stores by type and quantity and made a mental list of everything that needed to be replaced and everything that needed to be purchased, and the list was long enough to require its own organization. By midday, the cabin looked like a place where people lived, rather than a place where people survived. The difference was not small. Eli came back from the trap lines at dusk. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the room, and something moved through his face that he did not quite manage to contain.
"Did you do all of this today?"
"Someone had to," Hester said. She was stirring a pot of stew over the stove, made from the last of the vegetables that were still salvageable and a strip of dried elk she had found at the back of a shelf. You have been living like an animal. I know, he said. He sounded genuinely miserable about it. I am not good at keeping things in order. I never learned. Take off your boots, she said, and wash your hands. Dinner is almost ready. He did both things without argument. He sat at the table and ate 3 bowls of stew in silence, and when he was done, he looked up and said, very quietly, that it was the best thing he had eaten in longer than he could remember. It is stew, Hester said. Yes, Eli said, but it is good stew. The days found their rhythm, not easily and not all at once, but piece by piece, the way a river finds its course, gradually and then with conviction. Wren warmed to Hester with a speed that was almost alarming. Within a week, she was following Hester through the cabin like a small, determined shadow, asking questions about everything. What kind of bird was that? Why did the creek freeze from the edges and not the middle? Did bears dream when they slept through winter, and if so, what did they dream about? Hester answered as best she could, and when she did not know, she said so, and Wren seemed to find this acceptable. One afternoon, 10 days in, Wren climbed into Hester's lap while Hester was sewing and said without preamble, without looking up from the bit of cloth she was examining, "Mama." Not Miss Hester, not ma'am, Mama. Hester's hands went still on the needle. She looked at the top of Wren's blonde head and felt something in her chest that had been sealed shut for 6 years shift on its hinges without quite opening. She did not correct the word. She sat very still for a moment, and then she went back to her sewing, and Wren kept examining the cloth, and neither of them said anything about it. That night, after the children were asleep, Hester went outside and stood in the snow and cried. She cried for Sarah, who would have been 6 years old, who would never call anyone Mama again. She cried for Wren, who needed a mother so badly she had given the word to the first woman who sat still long enough. She cried for herself, for the strange half-life she was building in this frozen place, and for the terrifying realization that she was beginning to care about all of it. When she came back inside, Eli was awake. He did not say anything. He met her eyes across the room and then looked back at the fire. She went to bed, but she understood that he had seen, and that he had chosen to give her the privacy of not acknowledging it, and that this, in its way, was a form of kindness. Cormac was the harder work. He was not unkind to her. He was not rude. He helped when asked. He did what was needed. He kept the firewood stacked and the water bucket filled, and occasionally, without being asked, he would do some small thing that needed doing before Hester noticed it needed to be done. But he watched her. Constantly and carefully, the way a wary animal watches something it has not yet decided about, cataloging every inconsistency, waiting for the behavior that would confirm what he feared. He came to her room late one night, about 2 weeks in, when she could not sleep and was sitting up with a candle and the leather-bound book that had been her mother's. She heard his footsteps, and then the door opened a crack and his face appeared in the gap, pale in the candlelight. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am fine. You were not sleeping." "No." He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he came in and sat on the edge of the bed with the careful deliberateness of someone who has made a decision and intends to see it through. "You do not have to stay," he said. "You know that." Hester set down the book. "What do you mean?" "Eli told me before the wedding. He said you did not have to stay if it was too hard, that the marshal would not come back right away and you could leave without it ruining things immediately." Hester looked at this child, this 8-year-old boy with the old man's eyes and the set jaw, and she understood what he was doing. He was testing the shape of the loss before it arrived, measuring it, trying to decide whether it was survivable. She understood this because she had done it herself, after Thomas and Sarah died, measuring every subsequent thing she cared about against its potential departure. "Is that what you want?" she asked. "For me to leave?" "I do not know," he said. "That is honest." "Yes, it is." He looked at his hands. "What I do not want is for you to stay until you decide we are too much trouble and then leave anyway, because that is worse. If you are going to go, it is better to go now." Hester was quiet for a moment. "You are right," she said. "That would be worse." Cormac looked up, surprised. "I cannot promise I will never leave," she said carefully. "I do not know the future any better than you do, but I can promise you this. If I go, it will not be because you were too much trouble. I do not have anywhere better to be, and I have nothing more important to do. I promised Eli I would help raise you and Wren, and I keep my promises. That is the only thing I can offer you right now." Cormac was quiet for a long moment. "My ma used to say that promises do not mean much if the person making them does not know what they are promising," he said. "She was right," Hester said. "But I know what I am promising. I am promising to stay until there is a reason to go that neither of us can help, and I do not think that reason is coming." He nodded slowly. He sat there a moment longer, then stood and walked to the door and stopped. "She made good pancakes too," he said. "Our ma." Hester's throat tightened. "I am sure she did." He went back to bed. Hester sat with the candle for a long time after that, listening to the wind and the settling of the logs and the quiet breathing of the cabin, thinking about what it meant to build something in the wreckage of other things, and whether it was possible to make something real from something that had started as a transaction. She did not have an answer, but she was no longer certain the question only had one. Eli was strange to live with, not unkind, not difficult in the ways she had braced for, but profoundly, almost comically careful. He knocked before entering rooms. He asked permission before moving furniture. He apologized for things that required no apology. The cold coming in when he opened the door, the noise of the stove in the night, the fact of his own presence taking up space in the cabin. You do not have to behave as though you are a guest in your own home, Hester told him one morning. He looked uncomfortable. I just do not want you to feel trapped, she said. Yes, if I felt trapped, I would leave. I told you that. Would you? He asked. In the middle of winter, she considered. Probably not immediately. But eventually. Then I will keep apologizing until spring, he said. She looked at him, something about the delivery of it, flat and dry and completely unexpected from a man who appeared to have been carved from the landscape itself, made her press her lips together against something that was not quite a smile. She made a list of everything they needed from town. It was long. Flour and sugar and salt and coffee and dried beans and lamp oil. Fabric for new clothes because what the children were wearing was disintegrating. Soap, a proper washboard, needles and thread, vegetables that were not already half rotted. The list kept growing until she understood they would need both the horse and a borrowed mule to haul it back. She and Eli rode to Coldwater Ridge on a morning when the cold had eased slightly, a relative term that meant the air would not freeze your lungs if you breathed carefully. They tied the animals outside the general store and went in together, and Hester moved through the aisles with the efficiency of someone who had calculated exactly what was needed and in what quantities. And Eli followed her and did not comment and paid for everything without visible distress, even when the total was more than he had planned for. Outside loading the supplies, he said. You are good at this. Good at buying flour, Hester said. Good at knowing what is needed. He lifted a sack that would have taken two of her to manage. The children are different these past few weeks. Calmer, cleaner. She loaded a bundle of fabric onto the mule's pack. Ren is easier than Cormac. Cormac is deciding, Eli said. Yes, he said it without sentimentality. As a fact observed and accepted. She found she respected this about him, the absence of self-deception about where things stood. On the ride back, with the mule loaded heavy and plodding faithfully through the snow, Eli said, You are staying. It was not a question. Yes, she said. He nodded, said nothing more. But his shoulders, she noticed, settled slightly from where they had been carrying themselves. It was April when Reed Dutton and his two companions found Cormac outside the general store. Hester was at the cabin with Wren when Eli came through the door with Cormac behind him, and she looked up from her mending and saw the boy's face and set everything down immediately. Cormac's left eye was going purple. His lip was split. There was dried blood under his nose, and his knuckles were torn, and he was holding himself with the careful stillness of someone taking inventory of what hurts and in what order. What happened? Hester said. Cormac went past her without answering and sat down on his bedroll and turned his face to the wall. Eli stood in the middle of the room. Reed Dutton, he said, and two others. Outside the store. 3 against 1, Hester said. Yes. She went to the children's room and sat beside Cormac on the bedroll. He did not acknowledge her. You do not have to tell me what they said, she said. But I need to know whether this was about the Duttons or about something else. Silence. Cormac, she said. He said into the wall. They said you are not my real mother. They said you only came here because you felt sorry for us. They said we are charity cases and nobody actually wants us and you are going to leave as soon as you get tired of pretending. The words landed in her chest like stones dropped from a height. She sat with them for a moment. Then she said, And what did you do? I told them to shut their mouths. Cormac's voice was muffled against the wall. Twice. Then I hit Reed. And then his friends hit you. Yes. Did you get any good shots in? A pause. I broke his nose. Good, Hester said. Cormac turned over. He looked at her like a person who has been waiting for a verdict and does not yet know which way it has gone. You are not angry. I am furious, she said. Not at you. At them. She reached out and put her hand on his shoulder. Those boys had no right to say those things. None. And they especially had no right to put 3 against 1 like cowards. So no, I am not angry at you for defending yourself. His eyes were wet, but he held it. He was very good at holding it, this boy. Too good. She got a cloth and cleaned the blood from his face and pressed gently at the eye and told him he would have a bruise for 2 weeks and his lip would heal faster if he left it alone. He sat still through all of it. That evening, after the children were in bed, Hester told Eli what Cormac had said about what Reed Dutton and his friends had told him. All of it. Eli listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. Then he said, We are going to see Frank Dutton tomorrow. Hester looked at him. All of us, he said. She thought about arguing. She thought about the risks of confronting the man who had already demonstrated his willingness to use the law as a personal instrument. She thought about Cormac on his bedroll with his face to the wall and the things those boys had said about nobody wanting them. All right, she said. They rode into Coldwater Ridge the next morning, all 4 of them, and tied the horses outside the Dutton Timber Building, which was 2 stories of dark wood and imported glass designed to announce itself as the most substantial structure in a town that did not have much competition. A clerk behind a front desk looked up at them with the expression of a man who recognizes certain kinds of trouble on sight. Eli said, I am here to see Frank Dutton about what his son did to my boy yesterday. The clerk went through a door at the back. A voice came through the wall, too muffled to make out words. Then, send them in. Frank Dutton was in his mid-50s, broad across the chest and going soft at the middle, with silver hair and a face built for confidence and accustomed to getting what it wanted. He sat behind a desk designed to make everyone on the other side feel smaller. His eyes moved across the four of them and settled on Eli with the measured assessment of a man calculating distance. "Mr. Vance," he said, "I heard there was some trouble between our boys." "Trouble," Eli said. His voice was level. "That is one word for it." Dutton spread his hands. "Boys will be boys. They scrap. It is part of growing up out here," Hester said. 3 against 1 is not scrapping. Dutton's eyes moved to her. He took his time about it. "You must be the new wife," he said. "I heard about that arrangement. Interesting timing." The implication was clear. Hester held his gaze without flinching. "The timing was what it was," she said. "But that is not why we are here. Your son and his friends said things to our boy that were cruel and untrue, and then when Cormac asked them twice to stop, they put 3 against 1 and beat him. We are here because that stops now." Dutton leaned back in his chair. "If you are expecting an apology from my boys, Mrs. Vance, you are going to be disappointed. From what I understand, your boy threw the first punch." "After 2 warnings," Eli said. Dutton's expression did not change. He looked at Eli with the patience of a man who believes time is on his side. Eli looked back. The silence between them had weight and direction, and it was moving toward Dutton, not away from him, because Eli Vance was not a man who looked away first. Dutton said, "I think you should be very careful, Mr. Vance. You have a family now. Something to lose. I would think carefully about that." "I think about it every day," Eli said. His voice was quiet. "That is why I am here instead of somewhere else." Dutton heard the meaning beneath those words. His jaw tightened, but he was too careful to rise to it directly. "We are done here," he said. "We are done here when I am finished," Eli said. "Your son stays away from Cormac. Your arrangements with the sheriff's office leave my family alone, and the business about my land to the north gets dropped before spring." He stood. "If any of those 3 things do not happen, I will come back, and I will not be nearly this polite." They walked out into the April sun. Wren was holding Hester's hand so tightly the bones ached. Cormac walked straight, not looking back. "That went well," Cormac said under his breath. "It went exactly how I expected," Eli said. "For 3 weeks after that confrontation, nothing happened outwardly." Then a letter arrived from the county office addressed to Eli, informing him that a Dr. Pelham of Coldwater Ridge had filed a formal assessment with the Territorial Welfare Board stating that Cormac displayed, and these were the exact words on the page, persistent violent tendencies of a pathological nature, rendering him unsuitable for standard family placement and requiring review of current guardianship arrangements. Hester read it twice. She set it down on the table. She picked it up and read it a 3rd time to be certain she had understood correctly. Then she looked at Cormac, who was stacking wood by the door and had no idea the document existed, and she felt something move through her that anger was too small a word to contain. She had seen dishonesty before. She had seen people say untrue things for self-interested reasons. But she had never seen an adult use the clinical language of medicine to attack the character of a 9-year-old child who had done nothing except try to hold his family together. She showed it to Eli that evening. He read it once and set it down and did not speak for a long time. "That is Dutton," he said finally. "He could not reach us directly, so he went after the boy." "What do we do?" she said. "We take it to Aldrich," Eli said. "First thing tomorrow. We do not let this sit." They rode to the courthouse before the children were awake the next morning. Judge Aldrich read the document with the expression of a man identifying something he has encountered before and finds consistently contemptible. He asked 2 questions: who had examined Cormac, and when. The answer to both was that Dr. Pelham had never examined Cormac at all, had never been within 20 feet of him, and that the date on the assessment preceded the fight with Reed Dutton by 2 full weeks. Aldrich noted this in his own hand at the bottom of the document. "This goes into the record against Dutton," he said, "not against the boy." He looked at Hester over the top of his spectacles. "Take your son home, Mrs. Vance. This document is worth exactly what it cost Dutton to purchase it, which in the end will cost him considerably more." They rode home in the early afternoon. Hester did not tell Cormac what had been in the letter. Some things a child does not need to carry. But that evening, she watched him at the table with his book, working through the words with the patient deliberation she had come to know well, and she thought about a man who would pay a doctor to sign his name to a lie about a 9-year-old boy, and she understood that Frank Dutton was not simply a bully or a schemer. He was the kind of man who, when he could not break a thing directly, would try to make the world believe the thing deserved to be broken. She was not going to let him. The weeks after that passed without further incident from the Duttons, and Hester began to let herself breathe a little more freely. Then the Dutton timber yard burned. She was at the cabin with Wren when she saw the smoke rising from the direction of town, a thick black column against the afternoon sky. She stood outside watching it for a long time before Eli and Cormac came back from checking the northern trap lines. Eli looked at the smoke. His face was unreadable. "That is Dutton's yard," he said. "Yes," he said nothing else, but she saw his hands close at his sides. Sheriff Cade arrived 2 mornings later with 2 deputies and a piece of metal he held out without preamble. A trap spring, twisted and scorched, with Eli's marking stamp on the side. "Found this at the origin point of the fire," Cade said. "Looks like yours." "I make a lot of traps," Eli said. "That could be from anywhere." Found right where the fire started, Cade said, along with some other things that suggest someone used a timing arrangement. He looked at Eli with the flat patience of a man delivering a prepared speech. You have got motive. The Duttons have been making things hard for you since January. Maybe you decided to even the score. I was here, Eli said. All day, all day. Cade looked at Hester. She can verify that. I can, Hester said. She is your wife. That is correct. She kept her voice level, and she is telling you that her husband was here all day on the 14th, working on the north face of the barn roof. The new shingles are still up there if you want to look. We have a neighbor 2 miles north who stopped by on the 12th and saw us both working. Cade studied her. The neighbor's name, Emmett Galt, she said. Cade wrote it down without indicating whether this satisfied him. He looked at the trap spring in his hand, then at Eli. I will be verifying everything you have told me, he said. You are welcome to, Eli said. When they were gone, Eli turned to Hester. Emmett did not come by on the 12th. I know. You lied to the sheriff. I protected my family. She met his eyes without apology. Someone put that trap at the fire to point at you. This has Dutton written on it from the beginning. I will not let them take you on a manufactured lie without fighting back with the only tool I have right now, which is time. Because in that time you are going to find out where that trap actually came from. She paused. That is what you are going to do, is it not? Eli looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. Yes. He went out the next morning before first light and did not come back until well after dark. When he came in, he was cold to the bone and his face was carrying something it had not been carrying when he left. He sat at the table and Hester set coffee in front of him and waited. There is a man, he said finally, worked for Dutton until last autumn when Dutton cut his pay and cut his position and then threatened to charge him for tools he claimed the man had stolen. This man has been living rough in the forest north of my second line. He borrowed that trap from my line last summer. He did not know I had marked it. And the fire, Hester said. He did not set it intentionally, Eli said. He was sheltering in one of Dutton's outbuildings on a cold night and his fire got away from him and he ran. He has been afraid ever since. He does not want to be blamed. He does not want any part of it. She looked at him. You talked to him? Yes. He will come forward. Eli wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. He will. I told him that a man lets an innocent person take the blame for his accident once in his life and carries it forever. Or he steps up and tells the truth and carries something lighter. He thought about it for a while. He will come forward in the morning. Hester sat across from him. The fire in the stove made its small sounds. Outside the wind moved through the pines. You did that alone, she said. It was my problem to fix. I would have gone with you. I know, he said. He looked at her. But I needed to do this one myself. He paused, searching for the right words. I have been letting you carry things that are mine to carry. I needed to remember that I am capable of solving my own problems. She looked at him across the table. She thought about the man who had walked into the Elkhorn saloon with shaking hands and asked a room full of strangers for a wife because he did not know what else to do. She thought about how far that man was from the one sitting across from her now, and she understood that the distance between those two versions of Eli Vance had been covered in exactly this kind of quiet, determined work. You were always capable, she said. You just needed something worth doing it for. He looked at the table, then back at her. He held her gaze for longer than he usually did, and she let him, and the silence between them was a different quality from the silences they had inhabited in January. Less empty, less careful, more like the silence between people who have earned it. 2 weeks after Tully came forward with his testimony, Sheriff Cade served Eli with a summons. Cormac was formally charged with assault against Reed Dutton for the fight in April. The charge had been sitting in Cade's desk since spring, waiting for the right moment to be useful. The right moment, apparently, was now. They appeared before Judge Aldrich on a Thursday morning. The courtroom held perhaps 40 people, most of them there because the Vance family against the Duttons was the kind of matter that drew a crowd in a small town. Reed Dutton sat in the front row with his father and a lawyer from Cheyenne and the particular self-satisfied expression of a boy who has been told the outcome in advance. Cormac sat between Eli and Hester and looked at the table in front of him with the careful blankness he had learned to wear over difficult months. Aldrich called the room to order and asked Cormac to stand. He was 9 years old and small for it, but he stood straight. Did you strike Reed Dutton on the 14th of April outside the general store? Aldrich said. Yes, sir, Cormac said. Why? Because he and his friends said things about my family that were not true, and they would not stop when I asked them to. How many times did you ask them to stop? Twice, Cormac said. Before you hit him? Yes, sir. Aldrich looked at Reed Dutton. He asked Reed the same question. Had Cormac warned him before striking? Reed said he had not heard any warning. Aldrich asked Reed's two friends who had been present. One said he had not heard a warning either. The other, younger and visibly uncomfortable under the judge's steady gaze, said he could not remember clearly. Aldrich sat back. He was quiet for a moment. The courtroom was very still. Then he said, I find the testimony of the defendant more credible than that of the witnesses for the opposing party, given that 2 of those witnesses are the same individuals who subsequently beat the defendant in a group of 3 after the initial exchange. The charge is dismissed. He looked at Cormac directly. You warned them twice before you acted. That matters. Remember that it matters? Yes, sir, Cormac said. Court adjourned, Aldrich said. Outside in the afternoon sun, Wren, who had been sitting with Emmett Galt's wife at the back of the courtroom, found Cormac on the steps and told him with great authority that she had known it would be all right the whole time. "How did you know?" Cormac said. "Because you warned them twice," Wren said, as though this were self-evident. Cormac looked at his sister for a moment. Then he put his hand briefly on top of her head, which was the closest he came to demonstrating open affection in those years, and they walked down the steps together to where Eli and Hester were waiting with the horses. The following month, September, Cormac hit Bram Dutton again. He came home with his knuckles split and his shirt torn and his face carrying an expression that was new and that Hester did not like. Not fear, not pain. Something colder, something that looked like satisfaction without any regret mixed into it. Eli was in the barn. Hester sat across from Cormac at the table and waited. "He came at me first," Cormac said. Hester said nothing. "He said things about you, about the family. I was not going to let him. Did you warn him first?" "Silence, Cormac." "No," he said. He met her eyes. "I did not warn him. I did not want to warn him. I am tired of warning people. I am tired of being the one who has to be careful and patient and kind while they get to say whatever they want and do whatever they want and nothing happens to them because their father has money and their father owns people." He stopped. His jaw was tight. "I am just tired, Hester." She understood. She understood it in her bones, the particular exhaustion of trying to be good in a world that did not always reward it. She had been tired in exactly this way for years before she walked into the Elkhorn Saloon and chose something different. She heard Eli come in from the barn behind her. She turned slightly and caught his eye and gave him a look that said clearly, "Let me handle this one." He stopped. He went to the stove and stood there and let her handle it. She turned back to Cormac. "Let me ask you something," she said. "When Bram Dutton is 60 years old and has lived a life built on money and cruelty and using people smaller than himself, and you are 60 years old and have lived a life built on," she paused, "on what, Cormac? What do you want that life to be built on?" He looked at the table. "What would your parents have wanted it to be built on?" she said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then his face did something difficult and painful and honest. "They were kind people," he said. His voice was rough at the edges. "They did not have much. But they were kind to everyone they met, every single person." She let that sit. "If you become someone who hits first and asks nothing afterward," she said, "then Bram Dutton has changed you into something your parents would not recognize. And he wins. Not the fight. The whole thing. He wins who you are." Cormac looked at her with eyes that were wet and angry and tired and 9 years old all at once. "So what do I do?" he said. "Just let them keep doing it." "No," she said. "You let Eli and me fight this fight. That is what we are here for. You fight the fights that belong to you when they truly belong to you, and you fight them with everything you have. But you do not throw away the thing that makes you different from them, just because you are angry enough to do it." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Your mother raised a good boy," she said. "I would very much like to help finish the job." Cormac looked at her hand on his. He did not pull away. He sat there for a moment in the particular stillness of a child deciding whether to trust something that has not yet proven it will hold. Then he turned his hand over and held hers. It was not everything. It was not the end of the difficulty or the beginning of easy, but it was real, and in the life they were building in this frozen high country, real was enough. Judge Aldrich rode up to the cabin on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the aspens had gone gold and the first serious snow of the season was still a week away from arriving, but you could smell it coming in the air the way you can smell a change before it fully announces itself. He was 65 years old and moved like a man who had been carrying the weight of other people's troubles for so long that his spine had simply accepted the load and bent around it. He tied his horse at the post and walked to the door and knocked with the knuckle of one finger, the precise knock of a man who has never needed to pound. Eli opened the door. Aldrich looked at him for a moment, then past him at Hester, who was standing at the stove. Then at Cormac, who was at the table with a book Hester had made him work through 3 times already because she believed in repetition as the foundation of real learning. Then at Wren, who was sitting on the floor near the woodbox drawing something on a scrap of brown paper with a piece of charcoal. He said, "I am not staying long. I have something to deliver and something to say, and then I will leave you to your morning." He came inside and stood near the door and produced a folded document from inside his coat. He held it out to Eli. "This is a writ from the territorial governor," he said. "It establishes formal protection for this family against harassment by Frank Dutton, his employees, and any agents acting on his behalf. It carries the force of territorial law. If Dutton or anyone connected to him moves against this family in any documented way, the response will come from the governor's office directly." Eli took the document. He looked at it for a moment without speaking. Hester said carefully, "How did this happen?" Aldrich looked at her. "I wrote a letter," he said. "To the governor. I have known him for 12 years. I explained the situation in full, the pattern of what has been happening here since January, the false charges against the boy, the purchased medical document, the planted evidence after the fire, the history of Dutton using the sheriff's office as his private instrument." He paused. "The governor has been looking for a legitimate reason to curtail Dutton's influence in this county for some time. My letter gave him what he needed to act. Why? Eli said. Aldrich looked at him. Why would you do that for us? The judge moved to the table and pulled out a chair and sat down with the deliberate care of a man whose joints require negotiation. He looked at Cormac. During your hearing, he said, I asked you a question. Before the fight, did you warn them first? Do you remember what you answered? Cormac said. I told them twice to stop. That stayed with me, Aldrich said. He said it simply, without embellishment. A boy who has been beaten and falsely accused and used by powerful people as a way to punish his father. And he still warned them before he hit back. He looked at his hands folded on the table. I have been a judge in this territory for 23 years. I have seen what happens to people out here when the hard years pile up one on top of another. I have seen what it does to children especially. The ones who survive sometimes come out the other side without something that was in them at the beginning. Something essential. He looked back at Cormac. I did not want that to happen to you. Cormac held the old man's gaze without looking away. He had learned this from Hester, this quality of receiving difficult things directly without flinching from them. Aldrich said, I also heard about the second fight. The one where you did not warn first. Cormac said nothing. I am not here to scold you, Aldrich said. I am here to tell you something I want you to carry forward. You get one more moment where you forget who you are trying to be. After that, the protection this writ provides becomes harder for me to defend on your behalf. Do you understand what I am telling you? Yes, sir. I am not telling you to be weak. Aldrich's voice was level and without judgment. I am telling you that the thing that made me write that letter was not that you were victimized. There are a great many victimized people in this territory, and I cannot write letters for all of them. I wrote the letter because you warned them first. Because that told me something about who you were that the circumstances of your life had not managed to take away yet. He pushed himself up from the chair slowly. Do not let it be taken away. He put on his hat. He looked at Hester. You asked your husband if he would be kind, he said, the night of the wedding. Ox told me about it. He looked around the cabin, at the clean windows and the organized shelves and the book open on the table and the small girl on the floor with her charcoal drawing. This is what a question like that can build when the answer is genuine. He nodded once. Good morning to you all. He walked out and mounted his horse and rode back down the trail toward Coldwater Ridge, and they watched him go until the trees closed around him. The silence he left behind was the kind that follows something that has shifted the air in a room. Then Wren held up her drawing. She had been making a picture of a bear, she announced. She wanted to know if bears could be kind or if only people could be kind. Cormac looked at his sister for a moment. Then he said, I think a bear is kind to its cubs. Wren considered this with great seriousness. Then she went back to her drawing, satisfied. Eli set the governor's writ on the shelf above the door where the important papers lived. He stood there with his back to the room for a moment. Hester watched him and said nothing. There are things a man needs to absorb standing up, and she had learned to recognize when Eli was doing that particular work. Frank Dutton's collapse was not dramatic. It did not happen in a single moment or a single season. It happened the way a badly built structure fails under the weight of a hard winter. Each weakness finding the next, the whole thing coming down under a load it had never been built to bear honestly. A man from the forest, whose name was Tully and who had worked Dutton's yards for 11 years before being discarded, gave his testimony to the county magistrate in November. He explained how the fire had started. He explained the trap he had borrowed from Eli's line the previous summer and had not realized was marked. He explained what Dutton had done to him and why he had been afraid to come forward sooner. He was not the only one. Once Tully's testimony was entered into the record, 2 other former Dutton employees made their own statements. Then a merchant in town who had been overcharged and strong-armed for years. Then the doctor who had signed the false assessment of Cormac, who had apparently been carrying the weight of that particular dishonesty since June and found it heavier than he had anticipated when he agreed to it. Eli had not orchestrated any of this beyond that first conversation in the forest. He had done the one thing, found Tully and given him the choice between a lighter burden and a heavier one, and the rest had moved on its own the way true things tend to move when they are finally given room. Dutton fought it. He hired lawyers from Cheyenne. He called in favors. He wrote letters to people he had purchased over the years and discovered that some of them were no longer available at the previous price now that the governor's office was watching. By spring, his timber operation was under formal investigation. By summer, his holdings north of town, the land he had intended to take from Eli, were frozen pending the outcome of legal proceedings he could no longer control. Sheriff Cade quietly resigned his position in March, citing health concerns. Nobody questioned this very closely. Dutton himself was not ruined entirely, not in the first year or even the second. Men with real money rarely are, but he was diminished. The particular authority that depends on people believing you cannot be touched evaporates the moment people see you touched, and Coldwater Ridge had watched Eli Vance refuse to be moved from January onward, and the town had drawn its own conclusions about what that meant. The family did not discuss Dutton much. There was too much else to do. The years that followed had a quality that Hester had not experienced in so long she had almost forgotten what it felt like. They had the quality of accumulation. Not the accumulation of grief, which she knew well, which piles up in the dark and presses down with increasing weight. but the accumulation of ordinary good things, small and unremarkable and continuous, the kind that you only recognize as a life when you look back across enough of them from a sufficient distance. Cormac grew. He grew the way boys grow when they have enough food and enough purpose and someone paying consistent attention, which is to say rapidly and sometimes visibly from one month to the next. By the time he was 12, he was nearly as tall as Hester. By 14, he could track elk through 2 inches of fresh snow and identify what was wrong with a trap from 50 yards, and read well enough to work through any book Hester put in front of him, which she continued to do with the regularity of someone who believed that the mind needed feeding as surely as the body did. He had his mother's patience, she thought sometimes. Whoever his mother had been, whatever woman had held her children in a broken wagon in a canyon in January and kept them alive through sheer warmth alone, she had given her sons something that the world had tried several times to take from him and had not quite managed. He still watched people carefully. He still measured his trust in small increments before extending it. But the watching had changed in quality. It was no longer the watching of a child waiting for abandonment. It was something more like the attentiveness of a person who has learned that paying close attention to the world is simply good practice regardless of outcome. Wren was a different proposition entirely. If Cormac moved through life with care and deliberation, Wren moved through it the way water moves through new territory, finding every opening, filling every available space, entirely unconcerned with the concept of caution. She climbed things that should not have been climbed. She asked questions of people who had not expected to be questioned. She befriended animals of uncertain temperament and brought home injured things and nursed them with the focused intensity of someone for whom giving up was simply not a category of available action. The nightmares had stopped before she turned 7. The grief had not stopped, would never stop entirely, but it had found its place in her the way that grief finds its place in children who are loved enough to carry it without being crushed by it. She talked about her parents sometimes, naturally and without crisis, the way you talk about people who are real to you even in their absence. She talked about them to Hester most often, perhaps because Hester was the one who had sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and said, "I know you want your mama," without pretending the wanting was unreasonable or something to be moved past quickly. She called Hester mama without ambivalence from the time she was 5 years old onward. She called Eli pa in the way that 5-year-olds adopt the most direct available term for the large, steady person who brings food and keeps them warm. And she never seemed to find any contradiction between this and the parents she had lost, because she was 5. And because children are more capacious in their loving than adults tend to remember. Bram Dutton came to the cabin in the winter of 1875. He was 15, and Frank Dutton had been arrested 2 months prior, and Bram had the particular look of a young man who has been living inside a structure that has just collapsed and is trying to figure out where he stands now that the walls are gone. He rode up alone on a cold afternoon when Cormac was outside splitting wood and Eli was in the barn and Hester was inside with Wren. Cormac stopped splitting and looked at him across the yard with an expression that gave nothing away. Bram got off his horse. He stood there with the reins in his hands and looked at Cormac and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I came to say I am sorry." The yard was very quiet. The axe was still in Cormac's hand at his side. He looked at Bram Dutton with the careful measuring attention he had been developing since he was 8 years old. Bram said, "What we did, what I did, the things we said and the fights," and he stopped. "All of it. I am sorry for all of it. I do not expect you to do anything with that. I just needed to say it." Eli appeared in the barn doorway and stood there watching. Cormac glanced at him briefly, and Eli gave him nothing back. No direction, no signal, no guidance. He left it entirely in the boy's hands, which was exactly the point. Cormac looked back at Bram. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Come inside. It is cold." Bram blinked. He had not expected that. Cormac set the axe against the woodpile and walked to the cabin door and opened it. He looked back once at Bram, who was still standing in the yard holding his horse's reins as though he had forgotten he was holding them. "Tie your horse at the post," Cormac said. "Hester is making soup." Hester was indeed making soup, and she looked up when the door opened and 2 boys came in instead of 1, and she took in the situation with the swift assessment of a woman who has learned to read rooms quickly and without making it obvious. She said, "Sit down, both of you. It will be ready in 20 minutes. Bram sat. He looked at the table and at his hands. He looked around the cabin with an expression Hester recognized, because she had looked at this cabin the same way on the first morning, seeing in it the evidence of a life being carefully and deliberately built. Wren appeared from the side room, took one look at the stranger at the table and said, "Who are you?" Bram looked at her. "I am," he glanced at Cormac. "I am someone who was not very nice to your brother, and I came to apologize." Wren considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. She was 7 and had developed strong opinions about nearly everything. "Did you mean it?" she said. "Yes," she nodded once. "Then you can stay for soup." She climbed up onto her chair and resumed the drawing she had been working on. Bram looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who has just been assessed by an authority he had not anticipated and found himself not entirely certain how he has fared. They ate soup. They did not have a long or profound conversation. Cormac asked Bram where he was living now, and Bram said with an aunt in Bridger, and Cormac said that was a long ride, and Bram said yes it was. That was most of it. The bowl of soup that Cormac pushed across the table to him without comment said the rest of what needed saying between them. When Bram left, Eli came in from the barn. He poured himself coffee and sat at the table. He looked at Cormac, who was looking at the door through which Bram had gone. That was harder than hitting him, Cormac said. Yes, Eli said. Good harder or just harder? Eli thought about this with the seriousness the question deserved. Both, he said. Cormac nodded. He picked up his book from the table and went back to reading, and Hester caught Eli's eye over the top of the boy's head, and they held that look for a moment, and there was something in it that was not quite pride and not quite relief but contained both of those things and something larger besides. Wren had been watching from her chair throughout all of this. She looked at Hester. That was kind, she said. What Cormac did? Yes, Hester said. It was. Wren looked satisfied with the world. She went back to her drawing. The years continued their work. Cormac was 16 when he and Eli built the addition on the north side of the cabin, a proper room with a window that faced the mountains. They built it over the course of a summer, working side by side with the ease of people who have been working together long enough that the work flows between them without requiring discussion. Eli showed him things and Cormac absorbed them and then did them, and occasionally improved on them slightly in small ways, which Eli noted without comment except for a particular way of looking at the finished work that Cormac had learned to read as approval. Wren was 13 when she started walking 3 miles each way to attend the school that had been established in Coldwater Ridge, a single room with a teacher named Miss Arlene Pratt who had come from Ohio and was the first person other than Hester who had ever suggested to Wren that her questions were an asset rather than an inconvenience. Wren came home from school every day with more questions than she had left with, and Hester answered the ones she could and sent Wren back to Miss Pratt with the ones she could not, and this arrangement suited everyone involved. Eli watched his daughter walk away down the trail each morning with the particular expression of a man confronting something he does not quite have the words for. He had not, in his 19 years alone in the mountains, thought of himself as a person who would feel things about a child walking to school. He had not thought of himself as a person who would feel things about much of anything. He had been revising this understanding of himself continuously since January of 1874, and the revisions showed no sign of stopping. He said to Hester one evening, sitting at the table after the children were in bed, that he sometimes did not recognize himself. She said, "Is that bad?" "No," he said. "Strange. I was the same for 19 years. Now I am different every season. I do not know what I will be next." Hester said, "That is called living. When you stop changing, that is when you should worry." He held her gaze. He did this more now than he had in the early years. He had been a man who looked away quickly, she remembered, as though sustained eye contact was a form of exposure he was not prepared for. He did not do that anymore. "I would like to talk to you about something," he said. She waited. "I have been thinking for some time about what this is," he said. "What we are." He said it without embarrassment, but with the careful attention of someone choosing each word before committing to it. "We started as a practical arrangement. 2 people who needed something and agreed to provide it to each other. That is what it was." "Yes, it is not what it is now." "No," she said, "it is not." He was quiet for a moment. "I do not know how to say this correctly," he said. "I have not had much practice with it, and I am aware that this particular thing is one where saying it incorrectly is worse than not saying it at all." She waited. "I love you," he said. He said it the way he said most important things, quietly and without preamble, as though the directness was the only form of respect adequate to the content of the words. The fire in the stove made its small sounds. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant water. Hester looked at him across the table. She thought about 14 years of mornings and evenings. She thought about the window he had cleaned one afternoon in the second winter without being asked, because he had noticed she liked the light. She thought about the night she could not stop coughing with the croup she caught from Wren, and he had simply sat up and been present until it passed, not speaking, not fussing, just there. She thought about what it had cost him to walk into that saloon with shaking hands. "Are you certain?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "I have been certain for a long time," he said. "I have been certain since the second week you were here, if I am honest about it. I am only saying it now because it took me this long to be sure I was saying it correctly." She looked at him. "I love you too," she said. She said it simply because it was simply true. He let out a breath she understood had been held for quite some time. They sat with it for a moment, the way you sit with something that has been true for a long time and has finally been spoken, which is different from the thing itself but is also its own kind of arrival. Then Eli said, with great deliberateness, "I have been sleeping on the floor for 14 years. Hester said, "I know." He said, "I would like to discuss that arrangement." She said, "I think the arrangement has run its course." He nodded. He looked at the fire, then back at her. "All right," he said. And that was that, which was exactly the right amount of ceremony for 2 people who had never needed much of it. Cormac was 27 when he brought Nora Whitfield to the cabin to meet the family. Nora was the daughter of a rancher from the valley south of Coldwater Ridge, a composed and clear-eyed young woman who shook Eli's hand with a firm grip and looked around the cabin with the appraising attention of someone calculating whether she could respect the people who had built this place. Hester liked her immediately, which was not something she did easily or often. The two young people walked out after supper to talk in the way that young people who are almost but not quite decided will walk out in the evening to settle the last of whatever remains between them, and Eli and Hester sat at the table with their coffee and were quiet for a while. Then Cormac came back inside alone. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at Eli with an expression Hester had not seen on his face before. It was not uncertainty exactly. It was something more like standing at a threshold and fully understanding the weight of what crossing it means. He said, "I want to ask her to marry me." Eli said, "Yes." Cormac said, "I have not asked the question yet." "I know," Eli said, "but the answer is yes." Something moved through Cormac's face. He absorbed this the way he absorbed most things, inwardly and without display, though Hester could see the shape of it in the set of his jaw and the way his eyes briefly changed. He looked at Hester. She could see him searching for something, some piece of knowledge that would be adequate to the moment. He said, "How did you know? How did you know it was right?" Hester thought about this. She thought about all the ways she could answer it, and found that only one of them was entirely true. She got up and went to the shelf where the documents lived, the important papers, the things that mattered. She found what she was looking for behind the land survey and the children's health records. She brought it back to the table and set it in front of Cormac. It was the marriage certificate from January of 1874. It was 19 years old, and it showed every one of those years. Worn soft along the fold lines, the ink slightly faded, the wax seal still holding but cracked across the middle. Cormac looked at it. He had seen it before, in the way you have seen something all your life without ever truly looking at it. "Turn it over," Hester said. He turned it over. On the back, in the small, precise handwriting that Hester had never mentioned to anyone and that had lived on the back of that document for 19 years, were 2 lines. He read them. He read them again. He looked up at Hester. His face was doing something she had not seen it do in a very long time, not since he was 8 years old and she was a stranger who had crouched to his eye level in a cold cabin before sunrise. Hester said, "I wrote that for myself. To remind myself why I had said yes." She looked at the paper. "I was terrified that night. I was not brave. I was just out of reasons to say no, and your father gave me one reason to say yes that was larger than all the reasons against it." Cormac said, "He was kind." She said, "He meant it." That was the whole of it. When someone means what they say, you can tell. It is not something you can manufacture or rehearse. Either it is there or it is not. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the paper in his hands. "Can I take this?" he said. She said, "It is your family's document as much as mine." He folded it carefully, with 2 hands, along the original fold lines, the way you handle something you intend to keep. He put it in his coat pocket. He looked at his father. Eli looked back at him. There was a great deal in that look. 19 years of it. The 2 of them in the barn, learning things that needed 2 people to learn properly. The long cold mornings on the trap lines in winter when speech was not necessary, and the cold was simply a condition of being alive and not a thing worth remarking on. The afternoon Cormac was 14, and he and Eli had sat on the ridge above the valley after an unsuccessful elk hunt, and Eli had told him, in his sparse and honest way, that the measure of a man was not whether he succeeded but what he chose to do in the moment after he did not. The night Cormac was 16 and had asked Eli whether he had been lonely before, in the years alone in the mountains, and Eli had been honest in the way he was always honest when it mattered, which was completely and without softening the edges. None of this needed to be said. It was already said by everything that had accumulated between them. Eli said, "She is good." Cormac said, "Yes, go ask her." Eli said. He went. The wedding was in the spring, in the meadow below the cabin where the wildflowers came in thick and various in May, and Hester had made Nora's dress from fabric she had been saving for something without knowing exactly what, and Wren had come back from her teaching position in Laramie, where she had gone after attending the territorial normal school, and had arrived on horseback 2 days before with her hair loose and her voice full of stories, and had proceeded to take over the flower arrangements with the focused authority of someone who has been told no her entire life, and discovered along the way that it had simply made her more determined. Half of Coldwater Ridge came, not because they were all close friends of the family, though some of them were by now, but because over 19 years the story of Eli Vance and Hester Voss had become something the town told about itself. A story about what could be built in this country if a person was willing to begin honestly. A story about a man who walked into a saloon with shaking hands and a woman who stood up from a dark corner, and a question that turned out to be the foundation of everything that followed. Ox Pruitt gave a toast that made people laugh until they were wiping their eyes. Judge Aldrich, who was 84 years old and should by any reasonable calculation not have made the ride from town, sat in the chair that had been placed for him near the front and watched the proceedings with the expression of a man whose long view of things has been thoroughly and satisfactorily vindicated. Reverend Whitmore had died the previous winter. The ceremony was performed by a younger minister who did it properly and at appropriate length. When it came time for the vows, Cormac reached into his coat pocket. He unfolded the marriage certificate with 2 hands. He looked at it for a moment, at the 2 lines written on the back in his mother's small, precise hand, and then he folded it again carefully and put it away and looked at Nora. He said, "Will you be kind to me?" Nora looked at him. She had not heard the question before in this particular form, but she was a perceptive woman, and she understood immediately that it was not a simple question, that it contained inside it the entire history of this family, and the understanding that kindness was not softness but the most demanding and durable thing one person could promise another. She said, "Always." And then more quietly, just for him, "Will you be kind to me?" he said, "every day, for the rest of my life." In the rows of chairs behind them, Eli reached over and took Hester's hand. She let him. They sat like that through the remainder of the ceremony. Two people in their late middle years with the settled quality of those who have come through a long difficulty together and arrived somewhere they had not known they were heading when they started out. The years after that moved differently. They moved the way time moves when you stop fighting it, both faster and more gently than before. Grandchildren arrived. Cormac and Nora's first, a boy they named Thomas after Hester's first husband, which was a thing Hester had not anticipated, and which required her to excuse herself to the kitchen and stand very still for several minutes before she could trust her voice again. Then a girl. Then another boy after that. Wren came home from Laramie every summer and brought whatever she had accumulated over the year in the way of knowledge and opinions and unfinished questions, and she deposited all of it into the family's ongoing conversation and departed again renewed. Eli's hair went white in his 60s. It suited him. He was slower than he had been. The trap lines were Cormac's operation now, but he still went out in the mornings when the weather permitted, and he still came back with the particular quality of quietness that the mountain gave him, which Hester had come to understand was a kind of replenishment, a thing he needed the way some people need sleep or prayer or the company of people they love. She was sitting on the porch with him on a September evening, when the light was doing what September light does in Wyoming, that low gold thing that makes everything look slightly more significant than it usually does. And Cormac and Nora's children were running in the meadow below, chasing something or being chased by something, and somewhere down the trail Wren's voice carried on the air, telling someone something with her customary conviction. Eli said, "Do you regret it?" She said, "Which part?" He said, "The night, the question, all of it." She was quiet for a moment. She watched the children in the meadow. She watched the light moving on the mountains. She thought about the room at the Elkhorn, the worn chair, the view from a window she had looked out of for 3 years without really seeing anything in it. The way she had packed everything she owned into one bag, and it had not taken long because there was not much, and what there was did not feel like hers. She thought about the first morning in this cabin, the pancakes that tasted like wood, and the suspicious boy with the old eyes and the small girl with the enormous blue ones. She thought about 100 winters and 100 springs. She thought about what it meant to be asked one honest question by an honest man, and to answer it honestly, and to have that answer turn out to be the truest thing she had ever done in her life. She said, "That night is the only night of my life I have not regretted from the very first moment." Eli was quiet. He looked at the mountains for a while. He said, "I walked into that saloon to ask a room full of strangers for a wife, and I thought I was going to walk out having failed, and I did not know what I was going to tell those children when I got back." He paused, "And then you stood up." She said, "And then I stood up." He said, "I had no idea what I was getting." She said, "Neither did I." He said, "I know. That is the remarkable part." They sat with that. The children in the meadow had resolved whatever question they were working on, and were now coming back up the hill toward the cabin, loud and grass-stained and thoroughly uncontainable. Cormac came out of the barn to intercept them, catching the youngest under the arms and swinging him up into the air, the boy shrieking with pure delight. Eli watched his son with his grandson and did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "I think I was a better man than I knew." Hester looked at him. He said, "I mean that I had more in me than I understood. I had been alone so long I had stopped looking. I did not know I was capable of any of this." She said, "I knew. I saw it that night, the night you came in." He looked at her. She said, "A man who would do what you did, who would ride 15 miles in January and walk into a room full of people he did not know and ask for help because he had made a promise to 2 children he had no obligation to. That man has more in him than he understands. I saw it when you answered my question." She paused. "I was only hoping you knew it too." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I am glad you stood up." She said, "So am I." The light continued its long, slow change on the mountains, the way it has always done and will continue to do long after everyone watching it is gone. The children came up onto the porch, and there was the noise and movement of them, and Hester and Eli were absorbed into it. Into the ordinary and extraordinary business of a family at the end of a good day in a life that had been built from nothing but necessity and one honest question. Later, long after, the people of Coldwater Ridge would tell the story the way people tell the stories that matter to them, which is to say imperfectly and with great enthusiasm and with the particular additions that come from a story passing through many hands across many years. They told it to their children, and their children told it on, and somewhere in the telling it became less about the specific people, and more about what the specific people had demonstrated was possible. They demonstrated that you could build something real from nothing but necessity and honesty, that the hardest country in the world could be made into something worth keeping by the simplest of commitments, held to day after day without fanfare. That a man who has been alone for 19 years still carries the capacity to love, if someone is willing to ask him the right question and wait for the true answer. They demonstrated that kindness is not a small thing, that it is, in fact, the load-bearing element of anything worth building and the only thing that reliably passes from one generation to the next without being diminished in the passing. And at the heart of all of it, underneath all the years and all the winters and all the children and all the fights and all the grief and all the accumulation of ordinary days lived honestly, was a question asked by a woman who stood up in a dark saloon at midnight because she had nothing left to lose and discovered in the asking that she had found the one thing worth holding. Will you be kind? He was, every day until his very last.